Hey everyone, welcome to the Rochford Files with your host Andrew Rochford, coming to you live late on a Tuesday night. And this is going to be a different type of stream. This will be my second one since I've uh, gotten on to StreamYard. So before I get into that, though, I got to share the links to the other socials. That way it'll all be ready to go. So tonight's a snowy night here in Denver and a possible snow day for me as well. So I hope that ends up being the case on that part. So the tonight's show will be it's a sports stream. So I got a full show of streams dedicated to sports stories. As you see in the title, it'll include the Brian Flores lawsuit, and then we'll get into Liz Cambridge exposing the WNBA pay wage gap. And then after that, Tom Nichols tried to accuse sports fans of being more tribalistic than people who are obsessed with politics, especially the ones who spend a lot of time consuming mainstream media sources. So I'm going to break down the argument because that's also an interesting breakdown of it overall. So I just got to share the link one more area, then we'll be ready to start off with the show. And other than that, the crossover will be the title for these shows where I get enough stories on sports related topics in order to fill about a whole hour of content. Otherwise, if I was still doing the traditional live streaming thing, which I may get back to once this channel sees some significant growth. However, I did do one of these type of streams back in July of last year around the time of the Olympics, but it was only on Twitch. So this is technically the second time I've done a stream of the crossover. And we're almost there. All right, let's get started with the show. As we're going to start off with the Brian Flores lawsuit that he just struck down on the NFL following. Part of it has to do with stuff that happened in the time that he was coach of the Miami Dolphins. Then other things are recent developments as he became a late coach on the open market, as he was the last coach that ended up being fired. And that led to him interviewing with a couple teams such as the New York Giants and the Denver Broncos, as they interviewed more coaching candidates than anyone so far. But they also got caught up into trouble, as you'll see this lawsuit layout, 58 pages total, So we're just going to go right through it. But I'm also going to try to pick out the important points in real time. That way you don't have to deal with the full word by word oration. So I'm about to get that up on the screen. And here we go. Hopefully that's legible enough for the viewers out there. So here's the class action complaint as the main teams of focus. The main focus is the NFL, the New York Giants, Miami Dolphins, and Denver Broncos, while everyone else is like a secondary sewer defendants in that case. Then it pulls a couple really key quotes here. And this one is pretty damning, but it's also good that Bill Belichick looked out for him. Sorry I fucked this up. I double checked and misread the text. I think they're naming Brian DeBull. So I'm sorry about that, BB. And that was Bill Belichick telling Brian Flores that 3 days before his interview with the New York Giants, that Brian DeBull had already been selected for the job. Wow. But this right here is an example of how the negative side to the Rooney Rule. It's the fact that black coaches are only getting interviewed out of obligation rather than it being a genuine interest. So that was a pretty revealing quote. And then the next, the main thing that the other pull quote they went with was from Martin Luther King Jr. Morals cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. The law cannot make an employer love me, but it can keep him from refusing to hire me because of the color of my skin. And that right there really does sum up the Rooney Rule very well. It's the fact that they can regulate uh, minority candidates to have more of an opportunity to get hired, but it doesn't guarantee that it's going to help them get hired either. And I think this is what the big purpose of this lawsuit is to serve. Now let's find the next point here. All right, number 4 is a good one to point out. Its 32 owners, none of whom are black, profit substantially from the labor of NFL players, 70% black. The owners watch the games from atop NFL stadiums in their luxury boxes while majority black workforce put their bodies on the line every Sunday, taking vicious hits and suffering debilitating injuries to their bodies and brains, while the NFL and owners reap billions of dollars. And the conservative take here is the fact that, oh, I wish I could make millions. But think about it, there's a lot of long term risk here. We've seen the examples of the dangers of trying to live through the CTE, like Junior Seau, and even in other avenues like wrestling, where guys used to take a lot of unprotected headshots. And you really do pay a price just to have a chance to make $1 million salary for a few seasons. And what we do know is there's a lot of turnaround in the NFL. Of the major four professional sports, the NFL has the shortest average career, which is about 3.5 seasons. Now, this goes into more of the breakdowns of how little representation Black people have above the player level. Only one of the NFL's 32 teams employs a Black head coach, and as of right now, the teams with openings have not chosen one. Only 4 of the NFL's 32 teams employ a Black offensive coordinator, and only 11 of the 32 teams employ a Black defensive coordinator. And that right there is part of a stigma that you've seen developed in the pretty much any sport, really. Black people are often, their coaching style is considered regressive and not like an offensive mastermind. While they have made a bit more progress in terms of the defensive specialist types, as you can look at in like the NBA, and it's pretty, it's a bit more split in the NBA, but there's also plenty of coaches who, Black coaches who have more of a defensive reputation. So then there's that development of like a stereotype that goes beyond the surface level here. Only 8 of the 32 NFL teams employ a Black special teams coordinator. Only 3 of the 32 teams employ a Black quarterback coach, and only 6 of the NFL's 32 teams employ a Black general manager. And that's another position where if you do not perform well, then the sports media perpetuates a negative narrative, and it's also one that tends to be more where you scare off teams into from the idea of hiring a Black GM or Black coach. And that's a part of why it doesn't happen more. It's because it always, the blame always gets stronger when they do a poor job in those positions, as opposed to the white counterparts who tend to get that extra year to try to turn a team around if it's as a new hire. But the difference is a Black coach or a Black GM who does not become a major success in those positions, they generally aren't in the second, third, and fourth chances that some of these white coaches do get. And that's just a bias that has been proven over time. Then next we go to number 7. And this comes from Troy Vincent, the Executive Vice President of Football Operations. There is a double standard. We've seen that. You talk about the appetite for what's acceptable. Let's go back to Coach Dungy. Was let go in Tampa Bay after a winning season. Coach Wilkes, just a few years prior, was let go after 1 year. Coach Caldwell was fired after a winning season in Detroit. It is part of the larger challenges we have. But when you just look over time, it's over-indexing men of color. These men have been fired after a winning season. How do you explain that? There's a double standard. I don't think that is something that we should shy away from. But that is all part of some of the things we need to fix in the system. We want to hold everyone to that, but why does one say get the benefit of the doubt to be able to build or take bumps and bruises in the process of getting a franchise turned around, while others are not afforded that latitude. We've seen that history at the professional level. And that was just the point that I was uh, talking about just before reading the quote, by the way. And another example, another thing I like to point out is that quote mentioned Jim Caldwell. And while has knowingly interviewed for the Jaguars job, we don't know if he would get it. He could be very good for a young quarterback like Trevor Lawrence, who needs a confidence builder after being defeated from a tough season, mostly under Urban Meyer. But the problem is he may not get that second chance. And then another well-deserving black coaching candidate is Eric Bieniemy of the Kansas City Chiefs. And he honestly could have been hired at least a couple years ago. And we've heard his name pop up, but we don't know if he's going to get that shot either. Let's go to 11. Even when black coaches get hired for coaching positions a rarity, they are discriminated against in connection with the terms of conditions of their employment, compensation, and terminated, even as far less successful white head coaches are retained. Moreover, black head coaches are far less likely to than white head coaches to receive second chances, even as white head coaches are routinely hired by teams, even when they fail elsewhere. Another point that I brought up just recently as well, and I'm sure if you compare the averages of the first coaching stints, you'll see that number would mostly hold true, and that a really successful coach like Mike Tomlin, who's been able to uh, keep the Steelers coaching gig for what, or like 16 years, 14, 16 years. Those are the strong exception. Well, normally after that second season, it's usually it. So it's been 20 years since the NFL nearly implemented the Rooney Rule, purportedly to try to combat the other lack of black coaches in the NFL. As first implemented, the Rooney Rule required NFL teams to interview at least one black person in connection with any head coach vacancy. The Rooney Rule has been expanded to cover general manager and other front office positions, as well as assistant head coach and coordinator positions. Moreover, as it relates to head coach positions, teams are now required to interview two minority coaching candidates, at least one of whom must be interviewed in person. We're about to uh, start to see examples of where that can be a real downside. It's because, especially when you're a black coach in the NFL and you've had a coaching position in the past, it gets to the point where you just know that you're there to help a team fulfill their Rooney Rule requirement, as opposed to a guy who may be looking for their first coaching job, even though you know the odds are against you. It's harder for you to turn that down. And the example of that was Leslie Frazier, who was the coach of the Minnesota Vikings, has gone back to being a defensive coordinator since then. He did a couple interviews this offseason, but then he turned down a couple others. And I believe that was because he sensed that he was just a name called in to fulfill the rule. And that's the downside of the Rooney Rule right there. The Rooney Rule is also not working because management is not doing the interviews in good faith. Therefore, it creates a stigma that interviews of black candidates are only being done to comply with the rule rather than recognition due of the talents. And that's what I just mentioned about some veteran coaches who recognize teams doing that. And now that you've seen a couple instances of them being turned down. And this is the problem with that rule. But the unfortunate part is it would still be less chances to for them to break through if it wasn't there. In January 2022, Mr. Flores, who spent 3 years as head coach of the Dolphins, found himself without a job. He was fired by the Dolphins after leading the team to first back-to-back winning season since 2003. The purported basis for his termination was poor collaboration. In reality, writing had been on the wall since Mr. Flores' first season as head coach when he refused his owner's directive to tank for the first pick in the NFL draft. Indeed, during the 2019 season, Miami's owner Stephen Ross told Mr. Flores that he would pay him $100,000 for every loss, and the team's GM Chris Grier told Mr. Flores that Steve was mad that Mr. Flores' success in winning games was compromising the team's draft position. So this is on a basic level why we have a draft lottery like in the NBA and the NHL. But at the same time, it is also highly insulting to blatantly demand that your coach tank. And I say that because it's really supposed to be a thing of roster manipulation that is supposed to make it harder for coaches to win. It's not supposed to be a demand coming down from above you. And we know that you're not asking a white coach with, doesn't matter whether they're an extremely experienced or a young first timer and still in their mid 30s. The fact is, this is just not going to happen. And there's people who like to downplay the racism of the NFL, and they say this is actually more of an indictment than exposing the racial problems that the NFL has. Then after that, another one of those things that the downplayers have gone to was Mr. Ross pressured Flores to recruit a prominent quarterback in violation of the league tampering rules. Mr. Flores repeatedly refused to comply with improper directives. Undeterred in the winter 2020, Mr. Ross invited Mr. Flores onto a yacht for lunch. Shortly after he arrived, Mr. Ross told Mr. Flores prominent quarterback was conveniently arriving at the marina. Obviously, Mr. Ross had set up a purportedly impromptu meeting between Mr. Flores and the prominent quarterback. Mr. Flores refused the meeting and left the yacht immediately. After the incident, Mr. Flores was treated with disdain and held out as someone who was non-compliant and difficult to work with. And that right here is another level of part of the problem of the lack of respect. It's one thing if a coach is willing to conspire in rule breaking, but when you know that a guy flat out refuses to and you still try to force him to do it anyway. From that point forward, Flores was ostracized and fired. He was subsequently defamed throughout the media and league, so he was labeled by Dolphins brass as someone difficult to work with. This was reflective of an all too familiar angry black man stigma that is often casted upon black men who are strong in their morals and convictions, while white men are coined as passionate for those same attributes. You see that? And it also is important to point out that when you're in a position like that, then management uh, allows the white counterpart to stand up for himself more, while, as you see with Flores, if he decides to stick to the morals and convictions and refuses to compromise those, you see what you get right there. Now we get to the part of the New York Giants who were interviewing Brian Flores, who could have been their first black coach in the team's nearly 100-year history. But the problem is the team lied and deceptively led him to believe he actually had a chance at the job. But then, as you see right here, this text message exchange with Bill Belichick proves that he was already just going to fulfill that Rooney Rule obligation. And I'll go over that little text thread as Flores is in the blue bowl. Sounds like you have landed. Congrats. Did you hear something I didn't? Giants? Bill says. Flores, I interview on Thursday. I think I have a shot at it. Got it. I hear from Buffalo, New York, that you are their guy. Hopes it works out. If you want it to. That's definitely what I want. I hope you're right, Coach. Thank you. Coach, are you talking Brian Flores or Brian DeBoer? Just making sure. Oh, sorry, I fucked this up. I double checked and I misread the text. I think they're naming DeBoer. I'm sorry about that, BB. Thanks, Bill. Okay, now that text message makes Bill Belichick a bit less innocent in my mind. It wasn't. I don't think it was a basic flub on his part. I think he really, but he saved face well enough at the end from the looks of it. Then the team in my city, Denver, is involved. And we know John Elway, big MAGA guy. And CEO Joe Ellis showed up an hour late to the interview that they had with Flores. They looked completely disheveled, and it was obvious they had been drinking heavily night before. It was clear from the substance of the interview he was only interviewed because of the Rooney Rule, and the Broncos had never had any intention of considering him a legitimate candidate for the job. Shortly thereafter, Vic Fangio, a white man, was hired to be the head coach. Whoa. And now that's a moment where you wish that for Brian Flores' sake that he had at least a recording of that interview. That way He would be able to capture slurred speech from Elway and Ellis because that would go a long way into helping substantiate that claim. Having discovered that what the Giants and the rest of the NFL had hoped to keep in the dark, Flores now brings up this class action complaint to shine a light on the racial injustices that take place in the NFL and effectuate real change for the future. And this is what Flores seeks from it. Increase the influence of black individuals in hiring and termination decisions for black general manager, head coach, offensive and defensive coordinator positions. Ensure diversity of ownership by creating and funding a committee dedicated to sourcing black investors to take majority ownership stakes in NFL teams. Ensure diverse of decision making by permitting select black players and coaches to participate in the interviewing process for general manager, head coach, offense, and defensive coordinator positions. Now, that right there would be a pretty good idea because I do think if, well, we see this in the NBA, if you're going to bring a bunch of your players on the roster to a free agent pitch, shouldn't you have some key players from your roster join in as you try to figure out your coaching staff as well? Because I think some of these other ideas are pretty much the elite ideas, like the ownership class ideas, even though the representation absolutely should be there at that level as well. I mean, the Carolina Panthers were in consideration of having a black owner, but they ultimately didn't go in that direction. And the Broncos, I guess it could be a possibility. Even though, as of right now, I don't feel that strongly about it, but we just don't really know who's going to come up with bids yet. Then there's more. Increase the objectivity of hiring and termination decisions for general manager, head coach, offensive and defensive coordinator. Require NFL teams to reduce writing the rationale for hiring and termination decisions, including a full explanation of the basis for any subjective influences. Trust personality interview performance. Require teams to consider side-by-side comparisons of objective criteria, such as past performance, experience, and objective qualifications. 3. Increase the number of black offensive and defensive coordinators. Create and fund a training program for lower-level black coaches who demonstrate an aptitude for coaching and an interest in advancing to a coordinator position. And one issue here is the fact that the NFL doesn't have a developmental league, because if there's one positive of the NBA and the G League is that there has been a lot of coaches a lot of former players who have gotten the opportunity to become a coach of G League teams, and that has at least been a bit advantageous for them to work up in the coaching rankings, even if they end up taking a job in a in the NCAA. And I think that's always going to be an obstacle to making this thing. Incentivize the hiring and retention of black general managers, head coaches, offensive and defensive coordinators through monetary draft and other compensation, such as additional salary cap space and complete transparency with respect to pay for all general managers, head coaches, and offensive and defensive coordinators. I think just on the surface level, that sounds like the least likely thing that would ever get pushed through, just because we know that even though they're trying, the idea behind it is try to even out the system and make it more representative like the players. We know that uh, it would be used as a loophole by certain teams to try to gain that extra compensation. And if there's anything that we're pretty certain about is that the sports leagues would not want that type of incentive to exist. Is there anything else that stands out? So, pretty much the rest of it is more of a historical perspective of how, like, pretty much all the other major sports is how slow they were to make progress of allowing black people to be in the NFL. And as you get up to coaching and executive level positions, it's even slower. But these are at least allegations enough that should shine a bad light on the NFL. But the problem is, I don't think your average fan is overly bothered by this in the way of like being critical of the NFL for this. But as they're more focused on the unethical ownership trying to pressure Flores into doing things that no coach should be pressured to do. But this is a league overall that just has been able to get away with it. And that's something you just have to understand whether you continue to be to watch football or not. It's it's stuff like this, and that you've got uh, people like Jay Z who are just there to try to to do rehabilitation for the way that they handled the Colin Kaepernick situation, because it was clear that he got ousted before he absolutely had to be. That was pretty obvious in my mind. It wasn't, and that he could have still been a quarterback in the league several years after this. So overall, NFL, the main teams who've had to respond have just tried to make statements that are dismissive of the claims that Brian Flores is presenting here. The NFL says this is a investigation without merit. The Broncos and Giants are also downplaying their the claim is being pushed forward by Coach Flores. And overall, this is uh, probably not going to be the wake up call that it should be for the NFL to figure out a way to change their system and try to improve their hiring process. Because what they're just going to focus on trying to appease Flores by uh, probably a settlement and some punishment of the Dolphins. That's probably what's going to happen. And then you're going to see the NFL continue their status quo of a league that largely favors white coaching and executive candidates, while either a black coach likely only has 2 years to make or break their head coaching future, regardless of, and that pretty much, and if they mess up in that time, that pretty much relegates them to being a assistant from that point forward. And that's just the system you got in the NFL. And they're really just going to use other forms of symbolism as a distraction to give you the illusion of a false sense of progress. And as of right now, that's what I predict is likely going to happen. Oh, that took a bit long, but I think there was a lot of details to work out from what Coach Flores had put forward uh, earlier this afternoon. And then next, we're going to Liz Cambridge, a 6'7" WNBA center, is revealing the pay gap that exists within the WNBA. So I'm about to put a tweet from her earlier this afternoon up. Ah, yes, the WNBA, where a head coach can get paid 4 times the highest paid player's supermax contract. LMAO. And y'all think I'm going to spend another season upgrading my seat on a flight to get games out of my own pocket? This is rough. We know that WNBA is a growing league, and the what you hear is that the NBA often has to support the league, even as throughout its 25-year existence or so, that they have to support the losses that the league has. But if that were really the case, they've been slowly starting to add more and more teams year by year, especially over the past few. And you've got teams in markets like Las Vegas and Seattle and Connecticut, which they have the advantage of that being the only professional basketball league in town compared to others that share NBA teams. So that right there is the issue at hand. But unlike other times where people have tried to point out the pay gap of the WNBA, it often gets compared to a men's sport. And the reality is, men's sports are generally more popular and compared to women's sports, even though it really always shouldn't be that way. And that there's women whose sports can be better than the men's version at times, like swimming, volleyball. But also, the other issue is those sports where uh, women get popular and are often also the ones that are niche Olympic type sports. But back to this point here, now they're pointing out the pay difference within their own sport. However, there was one moment where I think women did have a viable argument to making more money based on like a performance type argument. And that was the US women's national soccer team. They've been far better than the men's national team for about this past decade and so. And I remember when the push was for them to get more pay, and they were filling those stadiums out just like the men's games were. So if you're really going to reward on performance, they absolutely deserved it. But when we look at the comparison of what coaches make compared to your highest paid players, a coach either makes about an average salary, maybe a couple of the top line coaches can make like a slightly above average one, but you usually don't have this type of hierarchy in a professional sport where the coach gets paid 4 times the amount. And I noticed some people took this as Liz Cambridge trying to tear down Becky Hammond for the salary, for getting that 4 times more salary. But the problem is, in a rightful hierarchy of pay, you're obviously there to see the players first. So, in theory, they should be the ones making the most money. You're not there to see a coach, even though coaches do put an imprint on the game. You're not just watching a coach, there to watch a coach nobody. And how are we not to the point where the WNBA can't make sure their players are able to get the proper seat upgrades needed to make it easier on their body? Because once you get in tall, I've heard people who are even as short as just being 6 feet could be tough in coach. And what we do notice is some of these professional sports entities will try to save as much money as they can. Like, for example, if you've ever looked at like WWE salaries, every now and then those get released. And when you look at the top and the bottom, wrestlers at the top, they get the private jet, the personal bus, the fully paid hotel. But if you're a lower tier wrestler, bottom end salary, you're having to take care of your own transportation and lodging. And this is also a pretty big issue being exposed here is basic rights and amenities for these players. Pair that with the fact that you notice that I don't think a lot of people know this about WNBA players is they often have to play another league overseas in order to make their living as well. They have to go play somewhere like Russia, China, pretty much many of the other same overseas basketball hotspots as uh, men do. And you want to know what's also makes the WNBA look bad in the process? The fact that many of these other countries overseas pay their women better for that winter season to play over there. And in fact, there are a few women who turned down coming back to who skipped the WNBA due to this. And it's more lucrative to be overseas for them. Also helps when their dollar is worth more and that inflation, for example, isn't going up while your salaries stay the same. And I know another shot that they tried to take at Liz Cambridge was the fact that she has an OnlyFans. But if you understand the salary structure of the WNBA, I think that max level player makes like 283,000. I mean, it's still a lot, but it's also very much on the lowest end of the totem pole when it comes to professional athletes. A lower end of it, I should say. So that was important to point out. So I'm about to get into the last topic for this stream tonight. And it's going to be sparked thanks to a guy who has ties with the Lincoln Project, Tom Nichols. He had a tweet following the conference championship games on Sunday. And this is kind of like telling on yourself, man. So I'm about to put that on the screen and for the closing of the crossover. But the weird thing is, it wasn't directly sparked by the conference championship games. It was due to the Tom Brady retirement announcement. I know my reaction to the Tom Brady coverage is churlish, but it also is consistent with 40 years of my astonishment that Americans know everything about sports figures, but can't read a goddamn map or name their own member of Congress who then bitch about democracy. This Tom Nichols guy is someone that often punches down on people. He is also someone who has been affiliated with the Lincoln Project. He's one of those white people who prefers negative peace than justice. And it doesn't take very many tweets to figure that type of shit out. But this is where the irony kicks in. Sports creates mindless tribalism in the way that other hobbies do not. It supports a gigantic money sink that most people should not be spending on. It displaces news and current news, events. It encourages hero worship of bad people. Shall I go on? Oh. Man, you gotta be kidding me with this, right? Because if you're someone who's lived through the start of the pandemic, not lived, but experienced it all, you'll have noticed how much, and you had time where you just couldn't watch sports for at least 2 to 3 months. Then you just realize how much this red blue party bullshit was what created tribalism, man. And I mean, sports people are a bit tribalistic, but it's far less impactful in comparison to the tribalism that you get fueled by MSNBC, CNN, and Fox News, the corporate media. They're the ones who create far more tribalistic people. And that's why it's so frustrating, because we've got independent media like myself, like the Revolutionary Black Network, and several others whose goal is to try to break people from these political cults and get them out of the red blue game, get people fed up with the bullshit culture war. And for a lot of anti sports people, their hobby is just leaving corporate media news on day through night. And that has a very negative effect when you on yourself when you do that all day. And for me, even though I stay exclusively to great independent media outlets, I, for one, do not endorse the idea of just watching that exclusively all day. You do have to break away and take a break and get some other form of entertainment in. But at the other time, I'm not going to wag over the tainted entertainment you choose to watch, because when it comes down to it, whether it's sports, your favorite TV show or movie, it's most of it's all very tainted in some way, shape, or form. Whether it's the corporate lobby interest, uh, State Department control, it's all there. But as long as you understand the flaws in in the entertainment you choose to seek, I think that's good enough in my book. But if you are ignorant to it, then I would uh, definitely question your critical thinking. It supports a gigantic money sink that most people should not be spending on. Hey, another one once again where the money sink of politics is far more harmful than this money sink of sports. Well, I do think that sports, by and large, is not affordable for the working class person outside of maybe going to 1 or 2 games a week. It's still, you still get more directly back from that type of experience as opposed to when you donate money to politicians. And if there's one of the biggest takeaways you should get from watching me, it's do not ever donate to politicians. Ever. In fact, I understand if you still, if you're a progressive who still believes in some form of electoralism, but the problem is you have to make them win with their own money or try to make them win without hardly with a very low campaign budget that the people by and large should not be supporting because the political campaigns are a grift. I mean, look at the money the Democrats raked in from running candidates like Amy McGrath and Jamie Harrison and several of those others who ran against Republicans in deep red districts who had no chance, and especially so because they were just Republicans, essentially, the blue Republicans. But then it's some vice versa for Republicans who can really fundraise off of being in deep blue districts. But at the same time, they're designed to make sure that you're primarily only donating to the oligarchy and make it freaking impossible to build a third party system, a real third party to exist by that. And you want me to think that people who spend a bit on fan gear and going to games is the real problem? Because with the amount of political spending that goes on, I'm sure that's like 2 to 3 billion during the major elections as most. And imagine what that type of money could do for some mutual aid around the country. And that's why it's so important to, if you're working class, the last thing you should be doing with your money is giving it away to a politician who, by and large, will almost never follow through on their campaign promises. As we've seen the squad and other neighboring progressives be such a disappointment for the people. Into places, news, and current events. No, the mainstream corporate media, it displaces facts. Have you seen how much that these corporate media lies, especially Russia and China, Cuba, and many other countries in the global south. That's the displacement that often happens, is all the State Department lies that get said on a daily basis. But then when great people within this movement, like a Danny Haifong, sets the record straight on China, and but you're treating him like the one he's crazy, and also Richard Medhurst very good at setting the record straight. In addition to the gray zone, but you really want us to believe that you're displacing that when, if anything, people like Tom Nichols, they're displacing the facts and they're deliberately misguiding you to make sure that this status quo remains. And if you want to talk about hero worship of bad people, the worst of the worst of athletes don't even hold a fucking candle to war criminals like Dick Cheney, Colin Powell, Ronald Rumsfeld. The worst of the worst professional athletes don't even come close to that. And you know how much of a failed state that we are when a person like John McCain dies, the amount of condolences a war criminal like him gets is sickening. While we had probably the most principled senator in terms of being anti-war in Mike Gravel, but then from the people who should, from the progressives who should be uh, con- giving their condolences to him first and foremost, were fucking silent while they did that message for war criminals. And you want me to think that the worst of the worst professional athletes have the level of toxic worship that a war criminal does? And all the people in charge of the attorney generals, the ones who keep this war machine churning, the ones who order the drone strikes, the sanctions, who deliberately try to install fascist coups in other countries. That's the real example of toxic hero worship. And that shit don't even come close. And the irony here most is this Tom Nichols guy, he participates in that political tribalism. He encourages people to throw their money into the political grift of this two-party system. He deliberately lies in line with the rest of the mainstream corporate media. And he's just as big of a worshiper of war criminals as the next guy. And their influence is far more dangerous than what sports are and makes this look like child's play in comparison. Checkmate. All right, I'd like to thank y'all for watching the Rochford Files with your host, Andrew Rochford. As you can see there, I really had to go in on Tom Nichols for the extremely ridiculously clown bullshit framing that he presented right there. So that'll do it for this special edition of the crossover where I go over stories that intersect in sports and politics. One of the reasons why I wanted to start the Rochford Files is so I could be the one in this media space that covers these type of stories more than anyone else. With that being said, if tomorrow does end up being a snow day and I'm off from work, I do hope to do another stream in the afternoon tomorrow, and hopefully it'll be on some more of your typical political based news, because I did hold back on a couple of those because I was doing the stream tonight. Also, so close. Keep checking out my reaction video to the Jackson Hinkle Sam Cedar debate. I'm only 4 likes away from matching my subscriber total. Please also keep boosting the subscribers and hopefully help me get some more consistent views. Like and share the videos, please. And with that being said, this is Andrew Rochford saying goodbye and good night.